Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film It Follows. One of the things horror can do better than any other genre is comment on the genre itself, whether it's referencing other horror films or being incredibly influenced by a certain horror film, or commenting on a certain genre or style of horror films. Horror has always been open to it. Look at the whole Scream thing. Look at everything that's happened throughout horror. They're always very blatantly, but always very smartly influence and use the history of horror film to make a new kind of horror film. It's a genre unabashedly interested in its history, more so than probably most genres in film. And It Follows does that immaculately well. It's one of the most impressive, amazing horror films I've seen in the theaters in a long time, and one that generally creeped me out also. It is the kind of horror film that you read about, that you wanted to see a classic horror film and experience in the theater and want to know what that was like. And after I saw It Follows, I knew I had done that. It's the kind of horror film that knows exactly the influences it's using and understands why those influences work so well and the things that influence those. It is a smartly, amazingly made horror film directed by David Robert Mitchell. This is his second film. It's the first one I saw, but frankly after this I'm a huge fan and I need to see the one before. He is an impressive horror director, the kind of horror director that comes around and makes you go, holy shit, someone knows how to make a good horror movie again. Both makes me love filmmaking and horror movies all over again, just like one of the classics. A young girl named Jay, played by Mika Monroe, who after going on an alright date with this guy, then they go to the back seat, and after having sex with him is gagged, and when she wakes up he tells her that there is something that has been following him, and it won't stop following him unless he passes it off to someone else after he has sex with them. And now it is going to follow her. It will never stop. It will keep following her forever until she has sex with someone else and passes it on to them. And if she is killed by this thing, it will then go back after him. If whoever the original person was, if they have sex with someone and that person has sex with someone, they are further spread out from it and they are not haunted by it anymore. But once that person who has it has sex with one, it goes to the next person and the next person, and she is currently haunted by it. And if you're not, I guess, infected or caught by this thing, then you can't actually see it. But if you've ever had it, then you can. And this thing just keeps following you slowly like a zombie. She first tells the police, but they obviously don't do anything, and then has her friend, her sister, their friend Paul, who they've grown up with, and another girl, and they all get together and try to go away to a lake house to avoid it and everything, but it just keeps coming, slowly following her and trying to haunt her as she has to decide, should she curse someone else with this, or should she find a way to destroy it? It Follows is incredibly influenced by John Carpenter, and the interesting thing about the John Carpenter influence that's going on right now, John Carpenter is very much a postmodern director. Even though he isn't buddies with Spielberg or Lucas, I'm sure they've met, assuming they probably have. He was kind of in that vein, like postmodern movie brat directors that are clearly very influenced by classic Hollywood and using those influences to make a really amazingly well-told, well-constructed film, like how Carpenter was incredibly influenced by Howard Hawks. But the thing about John Carpenter is he's always commenting on genre, whether he's deconstructing them or combining two genres or having it really be a Western and not be something else. As much as Halloween kind of feels very ordinary and simple, it's really a deconstructionist kind of horror film. And It Follows feels like it's a film that's very influenced by deconstructionist horror films. It feels like it understands like a deconstructionist horror film, and it honestly feels like a film that came after the post-Halloween wave. If the post-Halloween boom had mixed up with Carnival of the Souls and was directed in kind of a Shining-esque way, the way the camera moves in this film with a deep focus and a real appreciation to the cinematography of a horror film, like weaving and having these amazing tracking shots, having things that are very Carpenter-esque, but it does feel almost like Kubrickian in a way. You never know what this it thing is, and you never know what it's going to look like, so when you're showing a crowd shot, you can really do a lot with that, with a deep focus where you can see everyone and you're not exactly sure who this person is going to be. You're never sure, and it's really scary in that regard. I was surprised how much this film creeped me out. After I left the theater, I was about to cross the street. Suddenly I was just like looking out, I was kind of in in a daze after this movie. It was just like so amazing, such an experience. And suddenly this car drove up next to me and I didn't notice it. And there was a second I looked at it and it really kind of freaked me out that it was just suddenly there. I didn't notice it. I was on the sidewalk, but it gave me that feeling. Is this like it follows? Is this following me? When I was on the subway, I was looking at people and it was like that creepy feeling that anyone could be following you. The thing about horror is not knowing is one of the scariest things in a horror movie. The whole idea of explaining someone's stupid backstory or understanding like, oh, this can happen or that can happen is total crap. You don't really need to know that. That ruins horror movies. In this, you don't know, did they get this curse because of some voodoo thing or some Wiccan thing or some curse from the old days? Has this been traveling for centuries? Is this new? You don't know. And that's scary. That was the scary thing about Halloween and Jaws. That's why we're always talking about Halloween and Jaws, because there's no rhyme or reason for the shark. There's no actual rhyme or reason for Michael Myers. People have tried to explain the fuck out of it, and I'm sure there's some fan in the comments who can, and it's not worth it, because that's not what was scary about Halloween. He was originally called The Shape because it was like he picked Laurie Strode at random. That was what was scary. And the director of this film, David Robert Mitchell, this was based on a reoccurring dream he had where something would just keep following him and no one else could see it and he couldn't escape it. And he really just wanted that sense of being scared and being in that moment. Not understanding why someone's after you, that is incredibly scary. That is incredibly frightening to not understand. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, you play by rules and this thing just wants to kill you and it makes absolutely no sense. And that's terrifying. And It Follows gets that just like a classic horror film can. It has that mystery, that scariness, that spooky ghost world logic. It has an amazingly great score that feels very John Carpenter-esque, that both terrifies it and is very moody and spooky and gets you in there. It has such an immediacy to it and it wraps you up that you just absolutely understand what's going on. You know what's going on internally with the character, but it's also playing with you. The score of this film is by Rich Vierland, who's also called Disaster Piece, but it's amazingly well done and it feels very John Carpenter influenced, but also because it makes it feel even spookier because it can play with the tempo, it can play with your perception of a scene. You can immediately understand if someone following them is spooky. It's like the John Williams score in Jaws. Like, that theme like scares the shit out of you because you know something is coming. This does kind of remind me of The Guest because it's really playing with genre. It's doing interesting things with genre. It's using genre in kind of an abstract way. It's so influenced by Halloween. It gets the genre-ness of something like Halloween and those kind of slasher films. It's semi kind of saying something about sex because they're obviously passing on the it that's following them through sex, but it's not entirely doing it in the puritanical way that those old slasher films are. I haven't really sat down with this more than once. I just saw it today, and it does feel like there's a lot more hidden within it. How come all the kids are always reminiscing about things they used to do and how they grew up and things, and in a way it helps you get into the characters because that's like when you're hanging out with somebody at work or something and they tell you a memory and you feel a little closer to them. It's not as clear cut as what's going on with Halloween. It's trying to being a little more mysterious, and David Robert Mitchell used that within this, that it is kind of like a dream. You're not exactly sure, is this the 80s? Is this now? One of the girls has an e-reader, but it's like a compact, which I don't know if that exists or not. It looked really cool. But then like they're watching TV through rabbit ears. It does kind of have this dreamlike quality, but it feels like there's more underneath, especially like the ending. I really want to pick this apart just the way I have done with Carpenter and kind of really understand that world. And it's a film that like I want to go into more and more, but it's also really scary and quite an experience. It is kind of very art housey. It does feel like it's shot similar to, I think, The Shining, with its deep focus, and its fades are reminiscent of The Shining quite frequently. It does feel very 70s horror all wrapped up into one. I did notice the Carnival of Souls thing, the idea that this girl is like haunted by this thing from this one experience and it just won't go away until something bad happens. I kept thinking of Carnival of Souls at least, and Carnival of Souls is a movie that really freaks you out, really spooks you, really haunts you, and It Follows feels that way. Maybe it's because she's so haunted by something that only she can see, much like the woman in Carnival of Souls. And there's an organ in one scene, so the lead actress in this, Mika Monroe, is kind of like the only real genre actress I can think of that I really like, just like kind of like a Jamie Lee Curtis. She was in The Guest also, which is another kind of statement on genre. She is really good in this. I think think, even better than she was in The Guest. I liked her in The Guest. She wasn't amazing. She does the kind of role she's supposed to well, but she is a very good horror protagonist, and she's the kind of like memorable female horror protagonist that you kind of fall in love with and idolize. You really get attached to her. They don't really give you a ton about her backstory. You know, she's in college, she's with her parents. Her performance really gets you there through like little moments, that even the moments without dialogue where she's looking to see if she can see this thing and who that person might be. All the kids in this film do a really good job of being like this gang of kids going against this it that's following her. It reminds me of like Nightmare on Elm Street and of course Buffy the Vampire Slayer with that group. It's a tight-knit group and you love the group itself even though you're mainly focused on her, but it's really kind of a group movie for a lot of it. Because the music's there, it does have this feeling of dread, like while you're watching it someone will turn a corner and you're like, that's gonna be it, isn't it? It kind of reminds me almost of, and I think this is a stronger film than the first Paranormal Activity, but the stillness in that film, just suddenly a door would close and you'd be like, what the fuck was that? And this has that in it, but it has kind of the immediacy of Carpenter and those 70s films that were a roller coaster ride, that were a fun audience movie. This movie is, but it's kind of in an art house vein. It's interesting that it acknowledges the fun of horror, the creepiness of horror, but it also can be very arty also. Kind of like an art house horror director had to make a genre slasher film and kind of did it in their own way. It's interesting that both this and The Guest feel very mid-80s. I'm not exactly sure what these two directors are interested in that period so much. That seems to be a real high point for this generation in horror, but I think much like Adam Wingard, David Robert Mitchell kind of understands the fundamental elements of horror short stories and the kind of horror movies that Carpenter and Romero and all those guys were interested in, what they're trying to say with those horror films. He kind of is interested in those, but he has his cake and eats it too, where he's like, well, I'm not really saying anything about sexuality, I'm not really saying anything about this or that, but I'm having fun with that idea, which is a little lame. I feel like he is trying to maybe say something. I've noticed the guys she's with throughout the film, I feel like portrays a kind of art that is kind of a little more like conservative, which you expect from the slasher films. They're actually kind of more politically conservative in a creepy way. Carpenter really wasn't. He was more of an existentialist, and I don't think this is as existential, but it kind of feels like it's kind of masquerading as such. But it's just such a wonderful horror film. I came out absolutely knowing it was my favorite movie of the year so far. It wraps you up in itself and its logic and its world and all the strangeness that's going on within it, and I just love it for that. I love a horror movie that I'm not exactly sure what happened and I don't want to know. I want to be scared. I want to think about all the possibilities of how random, the randomness and the strangeness, wanting to rewatch it again and go back into that world in a way that most of these horror films, they go, I don't know, maybe if it's on TV and I'm bored or something. This isn't that way. I'm passionate about this. I'm passionate about it in a way that I haven't been for a horror film in years and years and years. And It Follows makes you passionate about that, makes you have faith in horror movies. And I think that's the amazing thing about a great horror film, and like kind of reminds me of Halloween that way, where you're like, whoa, I didn't think they could do this. It brings a new major director, David Robert Mitchell, somebody that I'm going to be watching and going to see whatever his next film is. He directed this so amazingly well, but I think partly because he's not really a horror director. His last film wasn't a horror film. He's in love with the horror cliches in the genre, but he also like wants to break away with them while still doing them. But he does that in a way that really works for the film and makes an amazing, really complete film experience that can still be divisive and still play around with the genre while still like not entirely getting into it, but also getting into it. That's such an amazing, well-rounded type of horror film that's probably one of the best we'll see in this generation. So if you have seen It Follows and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. I've actually reviewed all the films of John Carpenter. That was my first director's series, and if you'd like to check those out, click on the annotation below. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.